that's pretty cool, and it's a reason to again discuss the old game there. So when I started working on that, I have come around a little bit on the 3D displays, where one of the interesting things that I had used Shutter Glass 3D like all the way back in the Quake 3 days, and I had never been impressed by it. There was always the ghosting problems that were terrible, but it still just never really looked that cool. One of the things that I can look back, all those decade ago on there, and there was one important thing that I just actually wasn't doing right in the 3D stuff. I was rendering 2 views, setting it all up there, but I was rendering it assuming that each eye had its own screen, which is exactly what you want for a head-mounted display, but it's not actually what you do when you've got a screen that you're looking at, because your eyes actually center on 2 different points, and you need an offset field of view, an offset projection matrix on there. So once that's worked in, the 3D is a little bit neater. You set it up, it looks pretty, it looks interesting there. You still have ghosting problems on a lot of the displays. I've played around with different ways to de-ghost by adding extra subtraction of what the opposite frame is, and you can help a little bit there. But even the very best TVs still wind up with some degree of ghosting there. It's actually some cool technology that goes on in the very latest generation stuff, where if you're flipping between the 2 views, well, first to step back on one of the ways to do 3D is with polarized glasses. Like most of the theaters are done that way, and in that case, you can have the projector changing the polarity between there, and it completely changes the view, and you only see half of it through the eye, which is the basic point of all the different displays, whether it's passive polarized or active stereo on there. But the problem is, any of these glasses, they don't block out all of the light. They block out 90-something% of it. But if you have a bright white in a black background, you will definitely see a ghost. There's nothing that we can do about that. The latest TVs solve half the problem, or the latest TVs and monitors, in that when you've got LCDs in the glasses and you've got LCDs in the TV, and they both have to change. The TV is changing from one frame to another, and the glasses are changing from black to clear and black to clear on there. So you've got these 2 transitions, and they're not even the same LCD technologies on there. They're going to transition at different rates, so you were always going to have this temporal overlap period where you were still seeing some fraction of the wrong frame through there. What's kind of cool in the latest generation stuff is when you have LED backlights on displays, you can be scanning your LCD, your transmissive display, and then those still take 4 milliseconds, even the very best ones, to go ahead and change from one color to another on there. But LEDs, like OLEDs on there, you can switch them in microseconds. So you can actually turn the entire display off, change it to another frame, and then turn the display back on, which gets rid of half of it. You still got transition times on the glasses, and you could sync those up. It was kind of neat where one of the monitors that I was testing, I was doing my latency tests on there, so I'm recording at 240 frames per second, and it's outputting at 120 frames per second. And you look at it, and it's this gorgeous, brilliant picture on there. Play back the 240 hertz high-speed video, and you've got black bars over half the screen moving down there as the display is actually completely off, and you don't notice you didn't notice that at all, and that makes for a really good display. But so the 3D stuff, it's neat. I hope everybody takes a look at the stuff side by side there. But my point had always been in the past that it's not the trade that I would usually make. If I'm going to have twice as much of something, using it for the 3D depth, I think, has somewhat limited general utility. It is sometimes neat in games, sometimes neat in movies, but it's not something that you wind up looking at most of the time that you wind up looking at your display. The thing that I'm happy about, though, is it's making more companies care about 120 hertz refresh, which I actually think is going to be more important in general for people that buy these high-end displays, because, and I've checked on a number of people already, if you buy something as a 3D monitor for your PC, a lot of people don't realize that you can actually change that up to 120 hertz on your desktop, and then everything is smoother. Your mouse cursor is smoother, your window drags are smoother, you can run games that don't wind up resetting that, and if they're tearing, the tears are half as obnoxious, and this is all a good positive throughout everything. It's not a mind-blowing thing if you just look at something and scrub a window around, But one of the demos that we have set up here is Doom 3 running at 60 hertz and then at 120 hertz right next to it. And for a casual gamer, it's still not going to make that much of a difference. But if you're a connoisseur of mouse control on there, it really does make a difference. And everybody should go and kind of check out that feel of going from 60 to 120. Now, that contradicts somewhat a test that I had done earlier in terms of reaction speeds and times on there. When, as I was going through a bunch of this R&D work, I dragged an old Sony 21-inch Trinitron CRT out of somebody's back closet on there, because a CRT, the wonderful thing about a CRT is that you've got voltage coming out of the back of your computer. That voltage goes out and it flies out the electron beam essentially, and it is making, it's making phosphors light up in handfuls of nanoseconds on there. It's essentially zero latency. It's the closest thing to a direct output that we've got on there. But I went through, and the other great thing about it is you can crank it up to 170 or so hertz vertical retrace. And I did a bunch of tests taking a game controller on there and saying, well, how does it feel driving around at... Obviously, I believe there's a huge difference going from 30 frames per second to 60. But there's some people that still can't even tell the difference at that point. I couldn't tell a difference, really, going from 60 to 120 with a game controller. But with a mouse, it's really easy to tell. Just move it around on there. It's just got this extra layer of quality, responsiveness feel to it. And my take on that is that when you're using a game controller, it's amazing to see people that are extremely skilled with game controllers, because it's really a poor way to interface to some sort of aiming orientation on there, because what you're doing is you're making this precise motion with your thumb, which is not the most precise way that you want to do something, rotating it side to side, and then you're integrating over time. It's like, I'm going to move this far and then I'm going to wait a certain amount, and that's not the most natural sort of way to control something. It's sort of two stages removed. Now, a mouse is a directly proportional device. You move your hand 1 inch this way, it translates into this number of degrees there. That is only 1 degree removed, and it makes a difference. I'm far from any kind of professional player, and the 120 hertz sure feels a lot better to me. And the pro players, it was funny for years seeing some of the pro players carrying around a CRT just so they could still get their super high frame rates on there, because that tiny little bit actually mattered. But it goes one step even further, where while anybody that's pretty serious about gaming will appreciate the 120 hertz benefit on with a mouse on there, but when you go into a head-tracked environment, everybody will be able to tell the difference. The problem is, it has essentially been impossible to get 120 hertz head-mounted display. I actually finally had all the pieces to put this together, where one company makes 120 hertz driver for one set of OLEDs on there, and it's like $10,000 worth of these low lot size parts on there. They don't make a lot of these. These are for basically military sort of head-mounted displays. But I went ahead and bought a set of those, thinking that, okay, I know this is important, but this is not going to be consumer-type devices on here. And I had hoped to be doing that as one of the things I was going to be demoing at E3, when we were first saying, all right, I'm going to show the Sony head-mounted display, which, it's kind of neat in Doom 3. You can have the field of view there. You really wouldn't want to play and fight your way through the game like that, but it was still interesting. Enough people had still been impressed by what you could do in there that it was worth showing and talking about. But I thought if I could get the 120 hertz displays, that would be one additional sort of level of interest to show there. But so I wound up with a bunch of problems with that. But what happened in the meantime on the way to that was, I guess I should also say, a couple of the other experiments that I did. I had spent a bunch of time building things with these little laser pico projectors, where I was looking for ways to get these wider fields of view that I thought was super critically important to this. And I was looking at a lot of ways to project onto curved surfaces using these. They're interesting little devices, the Microvision laser pico projectors. It's again one of these things where I'm not sure actually what the supposed market is for these things, where you can plug it into your cell phone and you can play Rage HD or a movie or something projected up onto a wall, but they're not really bright enough to do in any of the places that you want an impromptu showing there. You have to darken a room and have a reasonably set up place for it. But they're it's a neat gadget. It's not that expensive on there, cheaper than a lot of displays, and it was kind of fun to tinker around with. But one of the things that I have mentioned in past years at QuakeCon is the appeal of direct laser retinal scanning, which of course everybody's like, shine a laser into your eye? What the hell? But there's a lot of things that are enticing about that, especially for someone with with poor eyesight. The idea of scanning a single beam of laser in there, you can still have malformations of your optical system on there, but you bypass a lot of focusing issues that your eye normally deals when you integrate light across the entire surface of the lens, and you've got all the different corrective problems there. So I've always been kind of fond of this idea of eventually being able to scan a sharper than reality view directly into my eye. And I was working on setting up different interfaces for some of this stuff, and by then my office was acquiring a lot of clutter of Edmunds optics and various little pieces of lenses and mounts and all the video cables connecting all these things together. And I did actually get to the point of very, very cautiously making a laser projected image on, okay, red channel only, least significant bit, brightness at minimum, check it with a card to make sure there's no focusing point there, then very carefully get down and get a laser imaged onto my eye. The funny thing was the guy at Microvision that I was talking with about this, I had sent him some email saying, I'm thinking about going and testing this. And I had already gone ahead and done it by the time his email came back saying, no, don't do that, your eyes are too precious. But the thing that I learned on that is what Microvision had also learned in some of their research is that it sounds all great that you're just going to have it's like ray tracing in reverse. You've got this pixel on the screen is coming in at this number of degrees, and we're going to shine it into the eyeball at that number of degrees, and it's going to focus in on your retina, and that'll be the proper image. And that's actually true when you're looking straight at it. The problem is that when you're looking at any given spot that you're seeing in your eye is actually light that's coming from, if I look at some point in the distance there, light from there is coming out and it's forming a cone that covers my entire eye. And your lens focuses those photons from all of those points coming down to it. So even if part of your eye is occluded in different ways, you still get something from that focuses in. If you've got a laser beam coming in, it hits one point on there, and if that point goes off the side of your eye, then you have nothing at that point. So just these tiny little motions. So you've got this cone of laser light coming in, focusing in down there towards your eye, and when it's coming in and it's hitting part of your lens, it comes in, hits your retina, does exactly the right thing. But as soon as you look one direction a little bit, then that corner of light that was coming in there is now hitting a part of your eye that doesn't focus in there, and that part of the world just kind of fades out. So there's a severe vignetting problem with that, where you look at a scene, it can be just right, and as you look side to side, the world fades out here or there. So when I finally understood some of the issues with exit pupil and focusing on there, I've learned actually a whole lot of Newtonian optics in the last 8 months or so on this. So that dashed a lot of my hopes for the laser retinal scanning stuff on there. There's a lot of work that does go on with being able to widen the beam and have it come out from multiple points, but by that point you're losing much of the benefit of these cool tiny little laser projectors that you can that you could mount easily in a lot of different ways and project onto lots of different surfaces. Now I still have sort of an interesting theory that it may be possible to have a small array of laser projectors to solve one of the currently unsolvable display problems. And one of the things that once you solve everything in displays, if we have our magical display that has infinite resolution, infinite frame rate, infinite dynamic range, if all of those things are solved perfectly, you still have the problem of you are looking at a flat surface that is a fixed distance away from you. And this was another thing that I didn't really appreciate before all of this work, is how important the focusing is for kind of telling depth in some places. Depth from focus is one of the common ways in robotics and video processing that you can figure out some of the stuff around you in an environment. But I was noticing that more and more, like when I'm in these virtual environments on there and I'm leaning over a table in Doom 3 and I'm looking at the table, and then there's the ground below that, and they're both perfectly in focus. I lift up the head mount and I look at my table and the floor underneath there, and you can tell much more as you change your point of focus between there, or even the case of if you've got one of those poor unfortunate monitors or TVs that has a mirror-like glass face, how you can find yourself focusing on the screen or focusing on what's in the reflection that's, that's actually 10 feet behind it there. And my harebrained idea I'm still interested in pursuing at some point is that you may be able to have a small array of lasers so that the optical effect that the eye does, instead of convolving an entire light field on there, it may be possible to, say, have a triad of laser points on there that you could adjust the focus on independently. You could have stippled dots so that at the focal point they come together or they spread apart, and you'd be able to kind of optically focus at different levels. And that would be very interesting to be able to have an image displayed where it really has variable depth of focus and your eye can change its focus across the different points. And that is actually different than retinal tracking, where you can figure out what you're looking at and change what you draw on there. The other interesting idea that I had that also didn't pan out, but was one of those things that sometimes you get those things where if this works, I will be, I'll be a genius. This will be fantastic. And my thought was that you've probably seen some of the image processing stuff where you can take a very blurry image and sharpen it back up by not just doing a simple sharpen filter on there. You can actually invert the entire matrix of an image, doing these really serious number crunching things, and it really is almost like the movies, sharpen, and pull a lot of that information back in. If it was actually there, you can't do it from a low resolution image, but a high resolution image that's been blurred by a convolution, you can invert many of those convolutions and make it sharper. So the reason that you can't just take a display and hold it up to your face like this is because your eyes can't focus at a very, below a minimum distance. That's why some people need prescription glasses. They're different for reading and up close things on there. Your eye just can't form an image properly there. There's one crazy company that's making special contact lenses that will allow you to focus on something very close. If you're willing to put a special VR contact lens in, which is kind of a cool idea. But my thought there was, well, can I make an image that's actually over-sharpened so when it's blurred by the eye not being able to focus on there, it comes out at the appropriate sharpness level? And I was thinking, well, mathematically, I don't see any reason why that shouldn't work. Okay, there's probably dynamic range issues when you do an inverse convolution of this, I might have to reduce the dynamic range. Maybe even if I could only have 1 bit, just at 50% grayscale, letting it go above and below, that would still be really, really interesting in many ways. But it did one of those surprising math things where it went, the solution just was completely unexpected and bore no resemblance to the original image. And that's one of those things that I do not have the math to properly analyze why that happened on there, but I still want to kind of experimentally investigate it a little bit further, because that idea still seems like it has some promise of building an image that's expecting to be later dealt with by the optical system in a non-optimal manner. And so all those experiments that I was building, I was going ahead and I had built a few of these things, and one of the things that I was looking at, some of the cases, like you have a laser projector and you just have a box, have a big giant box on your head at that distance, just to have a reasonably wide field of view project. Obviously not something that you're going to wind up selling or even showing to somebody else, but perhaps a way to have a wide field of view. But at about this time was when I first came into contact with Palmer Luckey and his Rift prototype on there. And there was the MTBS, meant to be seen in 3D.com on there. They have a forum for people talking about virtual and augmented reality. And I had been lurking there for a little bit, just kind of learning the lay of the land. And he had been posting kind of his progress of building significant homebrew head-mounted displays. And I contacted him. It looked like he was actually at the point of having something that was really exciting, like 90-degree field of view, very lightweight, just interesting here if it was all it was cracked up to be. So I sent him an email, told him that I've been working with the Sonys, and I'm going to be doing a demo at E3, and I've got these 120 hertz things that I'm working on, and the Sony as a baseline. Wondering if he'd be interested in letting me take a look at what he'd been working on. And that was one of those times when it's good to be me. It's good to have people know who I am. And he sent me the only prototype he had on hand, just kind of no questions asked. And mailed it off to me, and it was really pretty amazing. Where at this point I tried a half dozen different head mounts on there. Some of them fairly expensive. You know, I had 10 grand in parts on this this one that I was working with. And at the time, he was talking about making this as a $500 kit. You know, he figures that he could source all of these parts and put it together for about that. So it's a really simple idea, and it's what I was coming around to after giving up on the lasers, where the idea is that, well, if you just have something like a tablet or a smartphone on there, and you put a simple set of lenses in front of it, and you know you can use pairs of lenses to have a proper exit pupil, or use simple magnifiers with deal with distortion, different things. But the idea of just I had all this, I would have these eyepieces, and I would pull out my iPhone all the time and just kind of look through the eyepiece at there and say, well, it needs to be bigger than an iPhone, but smaller than an iPad, something in that neighborhood tablet-wise. And I made some rough looking around. I was still harassing a lot of different LCD embedded companies about 120 hertz drivers on there, you know, without any luck. But I hadn't sourced like exactly the right sort of panel. But here was Palmer that it looked like he had picked out exactly the right parts for this, and you know, it looked like pretty much what I wanted to do. He had just gone and done it, you know, before he even knew I was interested in working on any of this stuff. So when I got it, the field of view really did deliver. It was, you jam it all the way up to your face, and it is a 90 some odd degree field of view on there, vertically, actually more than horizontally, because what it actually is, it's a 1280 by 800 display panel. It's this little 6 and something inch panel with set of optics for each eye there, and you look through the eyes. It's relatively low resolution because you've got, instead of having a display for each eye, it's one display shared by the eyes, which in many ways is much, much nicer from a programming standpoint. A lot of the cheap consumer head-mounted displays, they would have a separate little LCD for each eye, and you could go into this frame toggling mode where you could go into either having the image come out at 60 frames per second to both of them, or you could toggle between them, and you would have this swap left and right button when it gets out of sync on there, and your eyes are backwards, and you swap it back, and it was just really not a good arrangement at all. Having one display where you just say, okay, you render the left eye on the left side and the right eye on the right side, and everything is good, is actually really nice for a programmer. And the real problem with this basic setup on here, so okay, it's low resolution, but resolution was not at the top of my priority list, but the optics in it wound up distorting the view quite a lot. It had a really pronounced fisheye effect on there. That has a beneficial effect when you think about it, in that you get more pixels crammed into the center than there are around the outside, which is not as effective as you might think, because your eye can actually go plus or minus 45 degrees without moving your head at all. So even if you have an awesomely cool screen here, you could be looking from one end to the other just by changing your view without getting picked up any motion by the sensor. But it is still somewhat nice. When you move your head around, you can focus in the center a little bit better, but still low resolution. But it's distorted around the outside. So when you're doing a good job at virtual reality, you want to have the world matched up so that it's physically accurate. So most VR demos, again, if you've tried them, they may be, if they're showing a game in there, they're probably pretending they're a mouse. They'll go ahead and have a head tracker, and we'll say, okay, we'll turn this into horizontal mouse motion, this into vertical mouse motion, and we'll pretend that this doesn't exist. And you're scaling it by some sensitivity value such that, you know, you're looking a little bit this way or that way, and it's moving the world a lot. And some people even try to consider that a feature. Well, you can turn, you know, massive amounts by doing that, and that's kind of what you do with Track IR on there. That's looking at a fixed screen, so you've kind of got an excuse there. But what you want is to have the world mapped correctly. You want to have the field of view actually accurate. Now, nobody would do that on the old ones if you only had 30 degrees field of view. You would still, if you were playing a game there, you would set your game to 60 or whatever, and it would be a distortion. So even if you did have head tracking on there, the world would be squishing and stretching as you looked around, because it wasn't the right window there. But you pick the right field of view, you pick the right scaling on your matrix, so that you want to know that looking straight ahead, it's straight ahead in the world. Look straight down, you're looking straight down in the world. 90 degrees, 90 degrees, turn around. You want to have it mapped properly to the world. So if you've got warping in the field of view, that means you could be moving around looking at this, and it's got pretty bad swimming behavior. But this is one of those things that we could so fix that in software nowadays. And I was having That argument with some of the other head-mounted display vendors about saying, look, we could totally warp all of this, because I was working on the laser projectors where my idea I was projecting onto a dome. So I worked out all the warps to be able to say, well, you can even take a 180-degree field of view, project it onto a dome down there, and I was just doing all this in a fragment shader at the end. It's not all that complicated math on there. And so it didn't take me long to work out a proper distortion correction for the optics that are in the Rift. And at that point, things started getting really pretty significantly cool, where you could have the game on there and look around and like, wow, this is actually something. It's not the holodeck. And it's funny, I realize I'm kind of dating myself by even making holodeck references. When I think back on here, where when id was founded, we did have, we took breaks to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation 20 years ago, and we've got people here that weren't even born at that time, but it's not there yet. The latency's still not what it needs to be. The resolution's lower, but there's a clear sense that this is not of the same class as what has gone before. I had a technology demo bit that I had done. I actually had a piece of Rage that I was using for various graphics research things. I was doing a number of little rendering technology demos, and that was what I initially used for all of this work. And it was nice because it was separate and fast, instantaneous compiles, and it was easy for experimentation. And that was cool because there's so much detail in Rage that I spent so much time in this one little part of Rage, and I would still see all these, that brick and that mark, and there's just detail that I never even appreciated playing the game for real. And I saw that every time I would spend some time in the VR space there, is that a lot of this detail, I'm sure our poor artists spending all this time doing this stuff that 99 people out of 100 probably just breeze right by and don't appreciate. But in there, when you're looking around and you can move your head and everything's, when you're walking by, you see something kind of interesting, you look over at it, and it draws your attention, and that's really just as it should be on there. So it was interesting with a bit of Rage there. Rage has a pretty good geometric complexity and excellent texture detail in there, because for a small piece here, for a test bed, I didn't want to pull over all of the mega texture stuff, so I just extracted one 16K by 16K chunk of a level on there, which is like a gigabyte of texture data uncompressed, and it looks great. If we could have shipped all of Rage that way, it would have been a terabyte or so of at least that for the entire game. And that would have been great, but obviously we couldn't have shipped that. But when I put it into Doom 3, I'm like, okay, now we've got an actual game. We've got a real game with characters moving around in there. We went from a static world, which had lots of nice detail, but you're just no clip flying around on there. But when you get into the real game, and just like in the start of Mars City, walking around the cafeterias and looking at the tables and looking at the characters in that, it was starting to get really pretty interesting there. And when you start say, okay, everybody wants to, it was kind of funny, Tim would be telling people about all of this stuff, and Tim would pitch the story about how it's awesome when you're kind of dodging fireballs and doing all this stuff, and we're sort of making that up at the time because we hadn't really done all of that yet at that point, but it turned out just like he said. It really is awesome getting in there, and interacting with the live environment in that way. And you have the case of, again, older technology, older graphics, lower fidelity on all of that, but it's live and real, and you're playing in and interacting with the game. So we are, I want to make sure I don't oversell what it actually is, because it's important to have anybody that's seen previous VR stuff, your expectations are already well calibrated, and you'll have a great time on there. But for the limitations of what we've got here, and the plan is that we will have one, hopefully two units here on Saturday that we'll let everybody come by and play. We'll just have a line and queue people through that. We're going to be using them for press demo stuff tomorrow, but I hope that everybody that wants to get the chance to spend 5 or 10 minutes with this to kind of gauge the experience on here. It's not done yet by any stretch of the imagination, but it is clearly pointing an arrow in the direction of where we're going to go. The downsides to it right now are it is limited resolution. Each eye gets 640 by 800 resolution. It's actually more resolution vertically than horizontally. That means that you can actually, if you look carefully and you've got good eyesight, you can resolve the individual parts of the pixels on there. blown right up in your face. So some people that are all about super crisp detail on there, it's not there yet. But on the upside, that's riding the kind of mobile device freight train of technology. We will have 1080p panels, probably they will be available by the end of the year. There's a 2.5K resolution panel that would be ideal for this that Toshiba's been demoing. We haven't seen engineering samples on this yet, but it would be ideal for that because it's a little bit larger. You could actually unmask that. You'd have 110-degree horizontal and vertical resolution, awesome resolution. Those parts exist. They're just not quite commercialized yet, most likely because the chipsets can't actually drive all of that yet. One of the interesting things there is I want all that resolution. I want 120 hertz update rates on there, and that turns out to be pretty hard for even a top-of-the-line PC. It's the first time in years that I've wanted a multi-GPU card because I can actually saturate my current top-of-the-line single GPU card, not rendering all the frames that I want to be able to render. I want to be able to render at that resolution. And there are some companies that are looking at displays that may be that much resolution per eye that you might be able to render at those resolutions. So you're up to some very demanding bandwidth and rendering numbers on there. So scale your expectations for resolution low. The tracking on it is measured between 40 and 50 milliseconds or so right now. I do everything possible on the software side of things. Like one of the interesting things that I do to save a frame of latency, and I may do something like this as we go forward into future Tech 5 games, is the way Tech 5 works right now is you sample a user command, you pull in all of your data from the joypad or mouse or whatever, you pass that to the game code while it runs in parallel with the rendering from the previous frame. So the time that input gets to the GPU, it comes in, goes through the game, goes through the renderer, then it goes through the GPU driver and GPU actual rendering, then it comes out the back. Something that I meant to try for years is forwarding head corrections on there, where while you have the game running in parallel with the renderer has already, it knows what it's going to draw, it's all been latched on there. I go ahead and I calculate a forwarded matrix where I say, all right, game, this is what you're going to be next time, but calculate the delta from this to the last frame. It's going to be these relatively minute movements, and forward that to the renderer and say, okay, render everything that you were planning on rendering from the last frame, but go ahead and add this extra little bit of rotation into it on the head. And that works surprisingly well. Now, if you have something that was just off the edge of the screen, like you had it stopped drawing everything there and you snapped your head all the way over, you might be able to catch a glimpse of something that wasn't there because the renderer needed to render it. But especially with these really large polygons on there, it's really a non-issue. And what we generally find is as long as it's drawing black or something appropriate like that, you don't really notice the screen coming in. So save an extra frame of latency there. All the good stuff of making sure the GPU actually syncs, because for benchmarking reasons, if you don't sternly tell them not to, most GPUs that are fill rate limited will wind up buffering up more than one frame, which can add additional latency. Going all the way back to the really bad old days of like Voodoo, where you could have a whole second's worth of mouse moves latched up in your GL QuakeCon or something. But that can still happen to a frame or so of delay in graphics drivers nowadays. But we force syncs and do all this stuff to make absolutely sure that they don't do anything wrong. But we still wind up with the three things that are currently problematic that prevent our latency from being really, really tiny. The displays on the current Rifts are an embedded LCD panel where it's not, it's an older generation LCD. So it takes about 20 milliseconds to go from gray to gray time, kind of the response time of an LCD. The best LCD panels now are in the 3 to 4 millisecond range, which is really quite an engineering achievement in a lot of ways. But this is not that. There's a long kind of bleed time. Now you can spin that a little bit as a feature where it's like, well, okay, tear lines aren't as bad because it's blending between them, but it's you wish you didn't have that. Then the other major one is we're still stuck at 60 frames per second on there, which turns out to be, I found one really interesting case in my work that brought this home, that highlights another aspect of displays. Once I got all this other latency out, I was working on the fast OLED display. Narrow field of view, but I was still using it for responsiveness testing on there. If I had a hard vertical line, like a door frame or something, and I would rapidly move my head side to side like this, you would just swear that the whole world was shearing, that it was warping. And I spent a lot of time thinking that my gravity vector tracking on the head tracker was factoring it in when it should be, and it was actually tipping the view. But when I finally realized that that's actually the slow scan of the raster, where there's a 15 millisecond difference between when the first line comes out and when the last line comes out. We render at an instant in time. A given time, we render a snapshot of the world there, but it gets scanned out incrementally, and in most cases, that really doesn't matter. There's very few cases where it really makes a difference. Rapid tracking in a head-mounted display is one of those cases where you can tell the lag in time there, and in many ways, we'd be a little better off if even if you were stuck at 60 frames per second, if you could squirt all 60, the entire frame in that time period, and then flash the screen at that instant, you would at least have a consistent time, rather than having a time that actually changes as you go up or down. But that's one of the real problems. That's at least 15. It's a variable time from 1 to 16 milliseconds based on where you're at there. And then there's still room to get something out of the input tracker on there. So we're at this 40 to 50 millisecond range. Now, something interesting happens at around 20 milliseconds, and I could get to these numbers by playing with the OLED displays, not desyncing, rendering 1,000 frames per second, so you get lots and lots of little banded areas that update very quickly, and also the through time messing with 120 hertz displays there. At about 20 milliseconds time, you get to the point where if you're looking at the view and say you're tipping your head side to side where you decorrelate the horizontal and vertical motions, which are easy for your brain to track. But tipping side to side with the current demo that we've got here, 40 to 50 milliseconds, it's responsive. It's probably far more responsive than any of the VR demos that you may have tried before, but you can still tell that you're pulling the world along with you. At 20 milliseconds, it feels like you've got a cutout in front of you, and you're moving it in front of a stable world. And that's really pretty magical. I still feel that there's the next thing after that where it works at that point definitely for the roll motion. When you've got the other tracking, you've got a lot of other things that your eye is doing with following and focusing where even 120 hertz may not be enough to be perfect for you to really believe that you're looking into a world with no lag that has no simulator delay. But my bet is that that's the magic number for immersive VR. Now, augmented reality is a whole other story, and I should mention that it does look like Michael Abrash still is going to be able to make it to tomorrow's panel. We thought that there was an emergency that had come up, so he didn't make it in today, but it looks like, fingers crossed, he is still going to be here tomorrow. So he's been at Valve working on augmented reality stuff, and of course he was my right-hand man in QuakeCon programming days, so it's big Michael Abrash fan. I'm glad to have him back with us. So it's going to be fun to talk with him and Palmer, who has a lot of experience with a lot of different head-mounted displays. So that should be it. We should be able to go into a lot of interesting detail about all that stuff tomorrow night. But so again, the demos that you should be able to see on Saturday, note the resolution, note the slight delay and latency on there. And then the other important thing that you can't do in this is you can't actually translate your position on this. I'm only using rate gyros and accelerometers to get your kind of which direction you're looking. One of the kind of clever things that's in there is it does have a little model of your head and neck so that as you look down, there is some parallactic motion. And that's one thing that I think even a lot of regular games should consider doing this, because your eye actually picks up a lot of your depth information from these very, very subtle motions of your head, and not so much from the stereoscopic view. And this, in many ways, in fact, I'm sure I would take accurate positional information over stereoscopic. I would take a monoscopic head-mounted display with really, really good absolute position sensing as well as orientation over binocular stereo. Of course, best case you want everything, but that is a really powerful effect. I've got a little bit of it there that I sort of calibrated myself doing this kind of look around, and if you're about the same dimensions as I am, there's going to be that one field where, yes, that looks completely natural looking down, the floor looks like it's solid, but any other changes, sharper or more leaning at the waist, then the floor will not feel like or will not look like the floor that your feet are standing on, because it doesn't know that your view should have moved an inch forward in virtual space. It just knows that you pivoted this amount and had this little modeled space. So the floor doesn't track exactly what you want. And that's the other way that I found I could give myself simulator sickness a little bit in this, is looking around generally pretty good, but if you stand and look down at the ground and you sway side to side, so at that point, you're not changing your orientation at all, just a very tiny amount from sort of the pendulum there, but you're moving a fair amount there, so the world, to your eye, feels like it's swinging on a pendulum underneath you, and that's very disturbing. Yeah. It's like, if you want to try that in the head mount, do that last. So it takes a little while to kind of settle down after pushing through that. So that bit of the world not doing what you expect it to is still an issue with the simulator sickness. Now, I have one of my R&D demos I've used a bunch of different sensors for this, where actually the first thing I tried was the Microsoft Kinect for Windows on there. And the thought was, well, I'll just, I can track the head on there and figure out and maybe do some other interesting things. The problem with that, it just gets completely killed by latency. The Kinect on Windows runs a little bit faster than Kinect on 360, or at least the demo stuff does, but it wound up being about a 70 millisecond time from wave your hand in front of the camera to the time that the processed stuff winds up showing up. And when I'm looking at times of wanting to shoot for 20 milliseconds, obviously 70 milliseconds of sensor latency is completely unusable in any way on here. But a better version was the Track IR system, which is this little IR camera you sit on top of your monitor and you wear something with IR tracking dots. And they pitch it for gaming stuff, where you can do some things like they amplify the motion. I don't know anybody who actually plays an FPS like this, but you can have small head motions turn into large amounts of turning. And it actually has quite clean data. It updates at 120 frames per second, and it gives pretty good positional and angular information on there. And in some ways, when I got into that, I thought, okay, this is really neat. All those subtle motions are very important. The killing factor for that, though, is that it's only got a narrow field of view. So as soon as you move enough and one of these little tracking dots falls out of the field of view, it can't give you a proper solution for where you are. And it is so incredibly frustrating to be, you're in this virtual environment on there, you're looking around saying, this is really cool. I'm looking around, I want to look at that. And you're just in the middle of a natural motion, and then the matrix sense solution goes away on there. And it is, it just kills the experience. It's not useful for a VR, for a real good immersive VR. I got to do some other neat things, like I did Fish Tank VR, where I had I had the regular, I was hacking on Rage at this point, the regular game running there, and I took the viewpoint modified by the Track IR, so you're looking at a normal 2D game, but you can move your head around, and it changes, and it's set up exactly as if that was a window on your desk looking into the world behind it. And that was pretty cool. That was interesting. It's not clear that you'd want to play a whole game with the proper positioning and stuff there, but you might. And that would be another one of those things that I think is worth coming back to. But the thing that was closest to the right thing on there, but frustratingly still a little far apart, was the Sixth Sense Razor Hydra, which is a magnetic tracking system, which is a consumerization of a lot of stuff that was used back in the old days of VR on there. But when you buy it from Razer, it gives you basically like a 360 controller broken in half with motion sensors that are actually absolute sensors in each side. And in many ways, that would be really, really nice for a VR situation on there, where certainly if you wanted to use that for your hands or something in there, that would be interesting. But what I wanted to do was take the sensor out of that and use that for the head tracking on there, because it gives a solution. It gives you position, it gives you orientation, there's no drift. It seems ideal. The frame rate, the update rate isn't as much as you'd hope. It updates at 250 hertz, but it takes 4 updates to make a full update. So really, it's 60 some odd hertz on there for full solutions, but still not bad. It had maybe 20 milliseconds more latency than the gyros, and when you put that on, there is a fundamental coolness to having that position information there. Like, one of the things that I could do, unlike the Track IR, where you just have a cliff that you fall off, where it's working great, not working at all. the Sixth Sense degrades gracefully. So the closer you are to the base station, it's really precise. They get millimeter level accuracy there. But the further away you get, the noisier it gets, which is just as you want. It's a graceful degradation. And the range isn't great on it, but if I have that base station on my desk and I've got that there, I can lean over it. And what's deeply cool is I could have that on, then I could sit down, put my hand on the virtual floor, be looking at sometimes the pebbles that were actually modeled in Rage in some places, little scraps of things there, you know, and crouch down, lean over, and look at it. It's like you feel like you could actually flick something on the floor. And that is importantly cool as an aspect of the virtual reality experience. But unfortunately, the Sixth Sense, as it stands right now, while it offers good precision, it offers poor accuracy in that it gives repeatable values that are millimeter level in position and decent enough on your matrix orientation solution on there, but it's a very lumpy configuration space. And if you're using it for gun pointing or a lightsaber battle, nobody cares that you're 10 degrees off. But if you're using it for your head orientation, you turn here and your view is 10 degrees off, that's really unacceptable. So the right thing to do is to integrate, fuse the sensor data on there so that we use the rate gyros for for the orientation and pull the position out of there. I spent a day or so trying to build a calibration map for it because, again, it's repeatable. And so I built all of this network of, I would calibrate all the points and map them from gravity vectors. And I built a nice calibration matrix where from this initial position, okay, I've got that calibrated correctly. But unfortunately, it's a couple six-dimensional problem on there. So a two-dimensional calibration map and the sparseness that I could achieve in 6 dimensions, it wasn't working out really well. It's one of those things that I think it would be better addressed at the firmware level on a per-channel calibration. The CTO of Sixth Sense is now at Valve, so there's a good chance that there may be some hacking going on at the firmware level there in the future. But it is still possible to integrate, track that, calibrate the orientation, so you have to still know whether what orientation you are relative to that for the position to mean anything, but you can make that work. The guys at Valve have their test bed integrated like that, and I didn't quite get enough time to do that. And it's one more cable that winds up going down the system on here, so that is not in the demo. So the three things that are immediately obvious when you think about VR that are yet to be done right on this: resolution's still too low, latency is still too high, and you don't have absolute positioning. But all of those are present in some degree. The resolution is good enough to be cool, the latency is fast enough to be cool, and the tracking with the orientation and a little bit of head-neck model is interesting enough to be cool on there. So it's all there, but the exciting part is that all of those things that aren't yet exactly what we want are all solvable in the imminent future. The 120 hertz stuff is mostly a matter of getting some of these board vendors to just care. In many cases, I don't think they'd have to change much at all. While a lot of these things are only spec to operate at a certain amount, it turns out you can run them higher just fine. Just nobody has cared about wanting a 120 hertz display in a small form factor. And so I've been going around kicking a lot of trees, trying to push lots of different companies into being involved in this in different ways, where I think NVIDIA is in a wonderful position to be excited about something like this, where obviously in the near term, here's a reason for multi-core GPU, multi-GPU chipsets on there that can suck up all of this performance that you can throw at it on there. And as we look further forward, eventually all of this is going to be wireless. Clearly, you're going to have something that is it's the equivalent of a tablet or a smartphone with optics on it, and everything is there. You put it on, there's no wires. You can start doing free roaming, walking around the world, doing different things, skin the world in different cases. That's obviously where it's going, but we need a couple more cranks of Moore's Law to get to the point where we're doing that. But, so it's a Tegra 6-based platform or whatever it winds up turning out to be. Getting the ball rolling there, I think, is excellent. Intel's excited about this stuff because it's a wonderful way to use Thunderbolt as an interconnect on here, where our prototype here has like 3 cables coming down. There's a video cable, there's a power cable, and there's a USB cable to the tracker. And what I pretty firmly believe is going to win is optical tracking for the there's a lot of things we want to do with that. So you want to put a pair of stereo cameras on the front of that. So for one thing, you would be able to go and tap the side and get passed through augmented reality, because this thing really does block off all your view. You're groping around blind trying to find your game controller or put your headphones on or whatever on that. So you really do want some ability to do that. And you probably want that as a safety factor there also if you're doing orientation tracking and environment sensing. You want to know if you're about to headbutt something on your desk there as you're moving around. So that adds up to a lot of bandwidth when you start looking at this. Say we've got, you can blue sky. I was able to play around with one of Imagine's high-end displays that has 1920 by 1200 per eye. So that's a lot of pixels that you're looking at over there. Right now they're going over 2 separate DisplayPort cables on there. And then say you want equal resolution on your cameras coming in. All of a sudden, already we've blown past what you can do with Thunderbolt today. This is a reason for Thunderbolt 2 or 3 or whatever we need on there. When you have multiple input streams running at 120 hertz, running at those resolutions, and those will deliver some real value there. So, Intel's interested in there, and I'm trying to push them to get some of their optical research people to work on this, the optical position tracking problem, which is a hard, unsolved problem in the general sense of saying, given a pair of images, give me an accurate map of exactly what's going on. And people have been attacking that problem for decades, and you've got some pretty good stuff, but it's not something that that you can nail down and ship it right now. But my theory is that you can simplify that problem and solve what we need to on this by trying to make an optical rate sensor for attitudes, where not so much say, tell me where I am at XYZ in this position, but instead tell me from optical flow analysis, how fast am I moving in XYZ as well as my angles on there. Because just like we don't care so much that the gyros drift a little bit, if you didn't correct for this, you swing your head around a whole bunch of times and the view will wind up being 20 degrees off. So we've got all this stuff in there that it measures gravity and knows which way is up and it corrects towards this. But we can do this in in position as well. It doesn't matter if you slowly shift a little bit on there. What matters is when you're making these translational motions, having the absolute orientation equivalent of a rate sensor would be absolutely good enough for what we need in VR. And I think that's a solvable problem. It's not a trivial problem. It's the type of thing that it's an excellent little PhD research project for somebody on there. And it's been great to see, like, Microsoft. It was great to see Microsoft commercialize a lot of the research work with Kinect, and this is actually probably an easier problem than Kinect there, and somebody should be getting to that. But so, Intel has interest in that. We've been approached by, lots of people about how do we commercialize all of this, and I'm almost a little scared that things are moving too fast right now, where my initial thought on this was that we know a bunch of stuff will be better a year from now. We'll have better displays. There'll be more software that supports it. And the original goal that Palmer was doing with Oculus was, I'm going to make 100 kits and sell them to the VR community. The guys that hang out on this board, and we chat about this stuff, we're going to build some of these so everybody can run their experiments on them. And in many ways, I thought that was going to be a really great thing, because there are things that need to be figured out about this, about different ways to interact with it, all the right ergonomic issues about how these things should be built, the standoff from the face, do we need focusing or interocular adjustment on here? There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered. But things kind of blew up after E3 when I demoed to journalists for the first time on this. It was an interesting thing where I had shown maybe a half dozen people at it what I sort of had on there. I had started making the changes in the game to make it, like decoupling the weapon, disabling some screen effects you don't want, and like head kick effects in 2D you definitely don't want in a 3D VR headset. And there are a number of things that had to be sort of disabled in the game to make it actually play really well there. But I'd only shown maybe a half dozen people. We went to E3, and I had a day of interviews scheduled. So people come in, I give them the show, and I talk about all of this. They play for a little while, and then I was going home the next day. But we had such a response from the people on there that everybody was talking about it. We had people saying that they had just been to Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, seen everything that they've got to show, and my God, this was the coolest thing that they've seen at the show. And this was, my thing with, I duct taped on a headband on top of Palmer's. It had hot glue holding the sensor on and a little foam wedge under there to line it up properly. This was very much the picture of a little homebrew project. But for many people, this was fundamentally cooler than all of the other Flash stuff that was going on there. And We wound up scheduling another day. I stayed another day and gave a whole nother batch of demos on there, and the press started hitting, and I had warned Palmer ahead of time. I'd been very explicit about this. Okay, I'm going to do this E3 thing, and people will report this as John Carmack's head-mounted display. Just brace yourself for it. I will get the transcripts. I will correct everything I possibly can on here, but it's still going to come out that way. And lo and behold, it did. But it worked out really well all around. But the problem is, everybody saw this press and was like, oh my God, VR's here now. And everybody's like, okay, how are we going to do the manufacturing? What are we going to do all of this? And I'm like, slow down, slow down. This has support for exactly one game right now. It hasn't shipped yet. And it can't play 3D movies. It doesn't have support for any of this other stuff. This is not a consumer device. So, a little worried about all of that going on, but Palmer went ahead and he launched his Kickstarter. So yes, the days are blurring a little bit together, but yesterday, I think, on there, and it immediately blew through the target on there, and he managed to, it actually came out at half the price that we were originally expecting, where the original conversation in the forums was $500 kit, build it yourself. The head tracker I was using was listing for like $99 on there, and so it's going to be a $600 thing if you want to be able to actually use it as a head track system on there. But he managed to get all the parts sourced in such a way that selling $300 assembled kits, and he's getting a lot of orders for them. So it's in the... I'm still afraid that there's going to be a bunch of people disappointed in this, that people see an article, see a head-mounted display, see somebody saying, my God, it was so amazingly cool, and they say, I want one. But there's a lot... The print's not even fine, but people are just skipping right past it. If you have to ask, a question about the capabilities of this, you probably don't want it. This is for people that, that are comfortable being on the very bleeding edge, helping to make something happen. And I was saying specifically, like, the people that do case mods at QuakeCon, this is the crowd that you want building one of these things, figuring out what the right head mounting arrangement is, because this is still not worked out. We've got my ski mask strap. Palmer's got two or three other things with him here, and I doubt we've hit the perfect arrangement on any of this yet. The current one mashes onto your face and you sweat into it, and you want a little bit more standoff and pinches your nose too much. And there's a lot of user factor stuff that you don't need to have a chip fab in your backyard to make a real relevant contribution to what's going to be affecting usability and ergonomics in sort of the emergence of the virtual reality. And I do think this is happening right now. I think people are going to look back and say that the tail end of 2012 is when things took off, because it is now not something that you have to convince yourself is cool like the previous generations of head-mounted displays. This is actually neat to show people. And what people can do with this as you start building what's exciting is all the things, as I talked about tablets and touch devices earlier, there's going to be a language that has to be developed for how you interact in virtual reality. What's different about a game when you do it as a VR game rather than a thumbstick game versus a touch game versus a mouse and keyboard game? And this is stuff that just needs to be experimented with and tried. And this is stuff that people can hack together. You can work on open source projects and learn a lot of this. So we can learn the language of interaction in VR like we have with touch. Now, a lot of this will change as we get camera output on there. But even just figuring out the right ways you interact with a controller, what you do with menus in there. And to be blunt about the Doom 3 support, where, yes, we have support for the weapons decoupled, the view warping is all corrected, but I'm not going to tell you that we've cleaned up the entire game to be perfectly playable through here. The menu systems and the HUDs are not visible directly in this. The cinematics don't have the right field of view on here, but by gosh, you can go to a level and play it in virtual reality, and it's pretty damn cool. But that's the level of what we're talking about here. This is not a consumer product that you go buy as a present for someone. This is an experimenter's kit where you can really be at the forefront of something that I think is going to be a very big deal in the coming years here. So I'm a little bit jittery now that things might be spiraling a little bit out of control, and after this goes off, I'm sure there are 5 companies busy in China preparing their versions of this that are going to come out into the market with some bundles, whatnot, and it's going to be great in the long run because there's no reason these will cost more than cell phones. Really, when you wind up, you'll have the whole range of things from low end to high end on there. we're looking self-contained versus running off of PCs. All of this stuff will get sorted out, but it's going to be a little bit awkward in the coming year or so as there's very little software support for it. But it's so cool when it's working, but there's not a lot of breadth to what you can do with it. But again, everybody should take a look at this because what we had, the response from the people that played it, it ranged from enthusiastic to really awestruck. For some people, this just pushed the button saying, this is what I always wanted to see in here. This is what I thought it should be like. But then there's some people that, yeah, this is pretty neat. It's not, they didn't have, they weren't waiting for the VR experience there. So it's something that that definitely is making an impact that on some people that is greater than any other hardware device that we've really got to play with. So I've actually gone already over the time. Let me look at my notes and see what topics I promised I would talk about and didn't. Graphics-wise, one thing that working with the gigantic pixels on the Rift really makes you appreciate is all of the picky issues of aliasing. And that's something that we saw this when we were doing the iOS games with Rage, when we had a game rendering at 640, 480, blown up onto a big screen TV. And we're like, ooh, there's lots of stuff you just don't, you get away with a lot of sloppy work on modern systems when cracks don't mean nearly as much when you're rendering at 1080p or something on there. But in this case, with the Rift on there, the pixels are gigantic, and aliasing is a pretty big deal. So on the PC, it's not that many pixels, 1280 by 800. You can render that at 4x AA and get a good job out of that. But one of the things that I wish that I could do, this comes down into that graphics geekery stuff that I don't think actually makes much of a difference for a traditional game played on a traditional output device, but I've at least convinced myself that going ahead and doing everything perfectly gamma corrected through all the anti-aliasing stages will make more of a difference in the VR side of things. Because one thing you can notice in Doom 3 when you're playing on this, even in the regular game, is some of the things that in-surface aliasing, because we wind up doing all of the bilinear interpolation of the diffuse maps and the specular calculations, where ideally you'd really want to calculate all of those at fixed forward points and just have a bilinearly gamma-corrected interpolation that happens going to screen space. But there's stuff that can be done, because you'd ideally, in a low-resolution thing, you at least want the world to be absolutely solid. No speckles, no anything. It's a little bit fuzzy because it's blurry, but if it's all nicely anti-aliased, you've got the proper support kernels around everything, your mind will buy that as well as you've just got foggy glasses, but you're still looking out into the world, while all the little twinkling and distracting things are still problematic. And there are, unfortunately, some content stuff that's kind of hard to get around, like when you have a very strong contrasty thing at the very edge of the texture and the geometry at the same time. The current anti-aliasing stuff just doesn't do a really great job with that. You can kill it with just massive oversampling, and that's one of the things that I did when I was playing with the earlier versions in my R&D testbed is go ahead and start rendering these enormous 2K plus resolutions, sample everything down, and just get a very, very nice blurry image. And I think that you pay more attention to graphical flaws in virtual reality when you're trying to buy it as reality than you do on a screen when you might be trying to buy it as a cartoon. So I think there may be some hope for the unrepentant high-end graphics geeks to contribute some real value still there. Yeah, I should probably talk some about ray tracing, which has come up in several past years. I mentioned before that all of our offline work migrated to ray tracing from GPU acceleration, and don't look back at all on that. When you give up a lot of theoretical performance, but everything is so much more reliable. There's two factors to that. One, not having the graphics driver doing its stuff outside of our control on there, which was amazingly problematic. You wouldn't think that it should be, that you have a render farm with 15 GPUs on there. One of them is doing something a little different for God knows what reason. CPU stuff is just always repeatable, it's always good, and when you can throw 24 threads on a single cheap box at it, it's not that much slower, and you wind up with you wind up doing things algorithmically that are pleasant to do on a CPU, that are extremely unpleasant to do on a GPU. We are approaching the time when you can render real-time ray tracing. You can do simple demo worlds where a couple years ago, I made a 60 frames per second, 720p real-time ray traced demo. It would have to sparsely update some of the pixels in areas that were challenging on there, but it would still work, and I'm sure if I did it right now, that same scene could work no problem. But the problem is there's a long way from that sort of techie demo of, look, I'm running around in this world in a ray traced world going 60 frames per second, to something where you say, okay, I'm running around in Rage or Doom. Those are much, much more challenging when you start bringing in the animated characters and the other dynamic geometry, and you want to have all the multipath blending effects. All these things you can do better in ray tracing, but it just does mean that while it seems like we're tantalizingly close now because you can do a real-time ray tracing demo, we're still not that close to being able to replace what we do in regular games. But it'll be a good day when we can. There was a pithy comment I saw on Twitter about somebody looking at the new Real-Time Shadows book, where it's a thick tome about all different real-time shadow algorithms. And somebody that's from an offline rendering world just made the comment that, if you need a book that thick to do shadows, you're doing it wrong. And there's a lot of truth to that. Ray tracing, it just works the way you want it to on there, while we are working through big, thick books like that on the approximations that we make in rasterization. But I also there's this enticing possibility for the ray tracing that if it could tie in with much lower latency output displays, like I would love to be able to ray trace exactly as the raster is going. If the raster is scanning or whatever is actually scanning it out on there, if I could say, okay, I'm going to ray trace this pixel right before they're integrating the head tracking continuously on there. And while that's, I could do that in a toy level. I could take my R&D test level, that little chunk of Rage that I can ray trace in real time on there, and I was actually pestering NVIDIA, can I get a scanline output counter? It's like I can look on a Nintendo DS or something, you can read, here's what scanline I am on, and you can do calculations on there. That's the stuff we lose in the PC space, that distance from the hardware. I was still tempted to do a demo just latching VSync, which you can get within, unfortunately, plus or minus a millisecond or so on there, and just predicting ahead, assuming a constant timer clock, doing that type of calculation, pre-warping the world around there. But that's incredibly enticing on ray tracing if you could update in lots of different places and different temporal orders on there. So that's also interesting, but we're still a ways off from being able to replace rasterization with ray tracing. WebGL and OpenGL in general, it's been, OpenGL is clearly just celebrated its 20th anniversary. I regret not actually being able to get in time to put my 2-cent quote in with the celebration of the 20th anniversary there, because it's obviously been important for a lot of what we've done over the years, and I'm very proud of the role that I played in, it might not be too strong to say keeping OpenGL alive and relevant in a lot of ways, because there were the dark years when D3D was trying to absolutely kill OpenGL, but we're in a resurgence of all of that now with OpenGL ES on mobile platforms and WebGL, and GL being used on consoles, and it's a healthy ecosystem right now. In many ways, it's primitive, archaic, unpleasant API to use. It was better than anything available at the time. That time was 20 years ago. OpenGL was a refresh of Iris GL there. It cleaned a bunch of stuff up. OpenGL ES actually was a pleasant refresh of OpenGL. Got rid of a lot of the really old cruft, but I don't even know how the driver writers support the current code base with hundreds of extensions that interact in different ways that may be enabled. I mean, that's got to be a nightmare situation, and the fact that some of them can actually work out quite well while supporting all of that is really quite a testament to their engineering there. I know in my shoes, I'd be like, burn it all down, give me the clean, simple, minimum spec, and everybody else out. We don't care that much. But that's not the way you actually have a successful business in doing all of that. So they missed their chance relatively recently to go ahead and do a major rethink. They basically chickened out. The ARB couldn't agree to leave some legacy stuff behind. That time's coming up again, thinking about it on here, where in many ways, OpenGL is, Microsoft's done a lot of great stuff in 3D. It's funny how, it's mostly wearing off now, but for for the longest time, Microsoft was was never looked upon as they were always blue screen of death and DOS and all of these bad things. But Microsoft actually does a lot of really good quality engineering in a lot of areas. They've got a research program. They do good work on the D3D stuff. They have they do excellent work in software analysis and security, and they've got a lot of really good people working there. So it was, in the early days, it was, yay, OpenGL, this D3D stuff is crap, but, it stopped being crap as they fixed it, and it's, it's probably better than OpenGL in most ways right now. But the extension mechanism is still important. That was something that's worked out really great for Rage. We got 2 extensions pushed through that are actually important, that will make a difference to a lot of people doing this type of stuff. There was the swap tear extension, which we lobbied on. The best way to make a case for something is with an existence proof. So we had Rage running on the consoles where we say, okay, we're 60 frames per second whenever we possibly can. If we miss a little bit, we resolution scale down and we back correct for the next frame. But what we want to have happen there is we'd rather get a little tear line at the top of the screen as we overshoot there and then go back to VSync there rather than drop from 60 frames per second to 30. On the PC, you only had the option of either VSync always, where 60 hertz just doesn't make sense with VSync on a PC in that case because miss a little bit, you fall to 30 and it's awful, or swap tear. And tearing is one of those things that it drives me nuts that we'll have people that will talk about, the crazy do everything gamma correct, add your film grain, do all this skin shader stuff, and all this crazy sophisticated stuff, and then have this big tear line dancing all over the screen. That just does not make, that's blinding yourself to the environment around you, and that's, I'm very happy that the swap tear extension got through and people can start using that in general. So lock to 60 when you can, tear if you can't. And then the other thing that we got through was the direct texture access extension with Intel, which is what, again, we show on the consoles. Look, we know what we're doing. We've got sinks and fences. We don't update something when this is in flight. We just make sure that, look, we want a pointer. We want to be able to say not text sub image for every little 1x1 page table update and all these blocks. They're just pointers to memory. We will go set them, and we take full responsibility for what we're doing. And this took pulling teeth to get something like this out, and Intel was the one that, my argument to Intel was that this is something that unified memory architectures win at. This is just, it is the same memory. The CPU can access it the same way. We don't have to worry about GART ranges and AGP mappings and tiling regions on the chip of the card, the card out there. And they can still make this stuff work in there, but it's a no-brainer for a unified memory chip. And unified memory is going to win. I mean, the days of the monster GPU card being a significant fraction of the user base are dwindling. Unified memory, just the economics of it will dictate it. It will win eventually in 99% of the cases. When you count mobile, it probably already is in almost those number of cases. So direct texture access is important. Nobody wants to talk about the texture swizzle formats, but eventually enough to keep pulling, and we've got linear format exposed on there, and hopefully that will be picked up in additional places. So the extension mechanism still works. It still has value there. We're able to deliver some real value to the ecosystem where doing that for D3D would be a much bigger challenge. That's the Microsoft cycle and all the arguments around that. Now, WebGL, coming off of that, is, when I first got asked about that, I was like, well, what? I don't see us really using this on anything. It's another one of these weird, do something in a web browser. We were doing this with Quake Live. It's like, oh, you're playing your game in a web browser. That was a plug-in. And a lot of people latched onto that aspect, which was never really the point of it. And in hindsight, we wish Quake Live wasn't in the browser. Maintaining that environment has really kind of sucked. And it's been problematic, and it doesn't offer you much value. But so WebGL as an ability to do 3D content in there is somewhat interesting as a platform, but it's tempered by the idea of using. It was bad enough doing mobile work coding in Java. I had fun doing the Orcs and Elves and Doom RPG and that stuff on the mobile platforms, but there is a sense of strange futility to like optimizing Java bytecode, knowing that you're like, okay, I'm doing good quality optimizing work that's then going to be interpreted by a virtual machine. And yes, you get just-in-time compilation loads, but it's not the same as programming directly to, to the metal, or even just to the instruction set for that matter. And web applications where you say, oh, okay, no, we're going to use JavaScript. That's taking the absurdity one level further. It's like, okay, we're going to do some kind of high-performance graphics application in JavaScript. This is just offensively wrong on some levels, but I have to temper that with the fact that so much of the magical stuff that happens through offensively bad code on there. All the magic that runs the web is scary, scary stuff, and it's not how like an optimizing-oriented programmer would have done things. So I have to temper that by saying there is an initial sense of violent revulsion, but that doesn't mean it's not a potentially valuable platform. And the idea of being able to, to render interesting content there is interesting, but you still have to manage your loads and all of that. And as it stands, I would think that in general, like cloud gaming or cloud applications in general, have a lot more chance of delivering real value to people than the web platform, because our experience with Quake Live with the web as a platform, it sucks. Every revision of a browser comes out, something breaks, we have to go in and figure out what's different about the environment there. Now, if you have to do something inside a browser, native client is much more interesting as something that, it started out as a really pretty darn clever x86 32-bit hack on the way that they could sandbox all of this in user mode interestingly, and now dynamic recompilation stuff, but it's something that you program in C or C++, and it compiles down to something that's going to be not your -04 optimization level for completely native code, but pretty damn close to native code, and you can do all of your evil pointer chasing stuff, that whatever you want to do as a to-the-metal game developer, but you still have to talk with the rest of the system through the web platform. And the platform specification is still really not good. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen lots of platforms, and platforms are very rarely what you want. Hopefully they evolve to, to what you want eventually. But going through WebGL, marshalling everything, there's a bunch of inefficiency there, but it's still way, way better than doing something in JavaScript. But it does bring up the whole scary issue of security is something that people should be caring a bit about now. In the old days, when we're at graphics performance, where just making our graphics do what we want is get to an acceptable level was the critical goal. But now, graphics is, in many, many ways, good enough. And I don't actually think it's a good idea at all to sacrifice security in something that might be used regularly, like a browser, for some degree of graphics performance. So I absolutely believe that the marshalling that goes on through the WebGL interface is the right thing to do. And it still scares the heck out of me, because just no one with a straight face could try to tell you that a WebGL application is fully sandboxed. That I just don't believe it for a second. We're constantly seeing people break out of sandboxes involving just the CPU, and everybody that's a graphics programmer has at some point crashed a GPU in some way by sending down some fragment program combined with some set of attributes. It's just not the most stable system. They're getting a ton better. We have finally, after a decade of me whining about it, we have virtualized resources on the GPUs. We finally have partially resident textures. I think John Paul's actually doing a talk with AMD at SIGGRAPH about some of the work that we've done with that. And I've literally been looking for this for over a decade. I was asking for this while 3DFX was still around, and I think it made sense even all the way back then. It's been very, very frustrating how we can have some stuff that takes off like a shot here, like the head-mounted display stuff, and then we can have things that I know I was right a decade ago on this, and I was right 5 years ago on this, and we've only just now finally gotten this together. It would have been better for consumers, graphics developers, board vendors. It would have been the right thing. And there are socio-cultural engineering issues with hardware developers that made that much, much harder than it should have been on there. I almost got my, a couple years earlier, it looked like I had finally convinced Apple that this was the right thing to do, that especially when you've got backed by Flash on here, this makes all the sense in the world. And it looked like the Imagination Technologies GPUs in there had page tables. They had them there for a while, nobody was using them. And it looked like it was going to work out. We were going to get this, we were going to show everybody on the mobile platform. But it turned out like the latest rev of the chipset, nobody was using this feature, and it broke, and nobody noticed. Which made me very, very sad, because that means that it's not coming to iOS for, you know, a couple more generations at least before they could write something like that off. But so, you know, virtualization of all of that's great, but still the GPUs are pretty scary in terms of what they may do all around memory, or what they may do in just peeking at other parts of the memory buffers on there. And it comes, again, back to the size of the... I mean, the OpenGL drivers, they terrify me. They're just, as a software engineer that looks at like lots of code, sees lots of bugs and problems, the scope of that code base and the interactions is really, really scary. And to think that that is going to be exposed to random web page content, that does not yet strike me as a particularly good idea. So I would favor completely remote streaming, where people find holes in video streamers still, and that's this nice compilation. You fit that in one function file. You know, you look through all of this and say, okay, there's a lot of scary stuff going on here, but I can chase through all of this, I can analyze it, and I probably only missed a half dozen things. Looking at an OpenGL driver and saying, okay, we're only going through the ES profile, and we've got our robustness set up on there to validate everything, but still, that's scary, terrifying, trying to say that you want that that you think that's actually going to be safe. I mean, they should do something like, if you really want to stand behind that, like make a public share of some of your sensitive internal data protected by the the OpenGL sandbox on there, and just see what happens. Because I don't think that if money and risk really had to go where they're saying it should go, I don't think too many people. I'd be interested to put that question to their engineers, but I don't think that they would take that bet on there of putting something that critical in the path on the driver there. It's just too complicated, and I don't know where to get to that point. A clean room implementation of the limited subset on there would probably be a good idea, but it's still a scary thing. Somebody asked about different CPU architectures like x86 versus PowerPC and ARM or x64. And that's something that was interesting how in the early years, like up through Quake, I cared a whole lot about CPUs. As we were going from 8086 to 286, getting our 16-bit, getting our protected modes, extended memories, when we started getting 32-bit protected mode on there, when we got floating point processing, those were critically important things that made fundamental differences in how we wrote code and what we targeted on there. It's been diminishing in importance ever since. MMX on, all of the different SIMD extensions. We take advantage of all of them. We have lots of SIMD code that makes differences. It makes modest differences in the total performance. When you look at kernels, you're like, wow, this rocks. This is 4 times faster. But when you integrate it over the whole thing on there, it's like, okay, it's helping, but this is no huge world beater like we had on some of the earlier transitions. But for the most part, since then, CPU architecture hasn't mattered all that much. We compile everything for all of the architectures on there. The big difference is between in-order architectures like current console PowerPCs and out-of-order programmer-friendly in-order cores. Simple in-order cores are optimizer-friendly. Out-of-order cores that are super scalar, have prefetchures, do all this stuff are very just kind of normal programming-friendly. And you get that case where it's great fun to go ahead and have something on a current console and say, this is too slow, I'm going to go in, I'm going to write better code that's going to double in speed or triple or quadruple. And you could go in and expect to go make those kind of differences there. And you say, this code was written, it's too slow, I'm going to go make it faster. Current into x86 processors can be frustratingly difficult to make real differences on. There's plenty of occasions where you have code, this is too slow. I'm going to completely redo all of this, change the tiling order, and prefetch this, and you get 5% faster with code that's twice as ugly and took you a bunch of time to write. There's a lot to be said for making programmers' life easier, and Intel has done that year after year. They just get better. The processors are better and better, and our code gets faster and faster, and we don't have to do anything about it. The consoles have been great for optimizers, where it was probably the right decision this generation. Give us more cores, make us sweat a little bit for it, but there's definitely a cliff there where my personal opinion is that the cell processors in the PS3 stepped one step too far there, in that they were, it was an optimizer's dream on there, but it was that step more inconvenient for the lack of direct virtual addressing or direct caching and everything. So it was awkward on there and painful, and you don't like doing a whole bunch of stuff there. But the ARM chips are somewhat in between there, where as an architecture, they tend more towards the x86 side of things, where you can have superscalar ones, you can have out of order. You wind up, in the uses of ARMs, the mobile platforms, you wind up being gated mostly by memory bandwidth. So you care a lot more about that than a lot of twitchy CPU optimizations on there. But they're great, they're fine. There's no CPU instruction set architecture that I actually care that much about one way or the other. It's not that exciting. There was a time when I would be excited about instruction set architectures, and I know when we were talking about Larrabee at the Intel people, and I it's kind of like, yeah, instruction set, SIMD, 8 wide, yeah, whatever. And let's talk about the system level architecture things, how the SIMD stuff is set up and all that. That was much more important. So I still don't care that much about instruction sets. 64-bit, we are at the very trailing edge of anything 32-bit relevant, so it's going to be interesting to see how ARM makes that transition. Obviously, we're fine on x64 and PowerPC there. So it is interesting to see whether, my suspicion is that GPUs have also stepped past that line of doesn't matter that much anymore, where up through DX9 was like the step up through floating point in CPUs, where each step was important. It made a real difference. You changed the way you did things based on this. After that, it's more like SIMD, getting DX10, DX11 class stuff. Yeah, you can do neat new stuff on here, but you don't require that to take the next step in what you're doing. Just more of the same is winding up being what 99% of the people wind up using anyways. Windows 8 adoption. At id, we stuck with Windows XP till the bitter end almost. We had almost nobody using Vista, and then we got to Windows 7, and everybody switched to Windows 7 on there. At this point, I don't think anyone is running Windows 8. We obviously should be testing that with Doom 3 right now, considering the product's coming out contemporaneously with that. As I said earlier, I actually have I have a good deal more respect for Microsoft than many in the sort of hacker enthusiast community do. I have perhaps less I have less comfort that changes in the UI paradigm are going to come off well, but I have no dog in that fight. I'm kind of excited to see a Surface tablet. Robert Duffy is trying to use a Windows phone for a month on here. It's all worth taking a good look at. But I'd be completely happy if Windows 8 didn't exist and we didn't even have to face this problem, because I'm pretty darn happy with Windows 7. There's really nothing that I'm looking forward to in Windows 8. As an OS, for the most part, Windows XP did what I wanted on there, and I haven't cared that much. But seeing that theme on a whole bunch of things here, where it was a huge difference as we went from Windows 3.1 to Windows 95 to Windows NT to Windows XP. Those were differences that mattered. And I think we're past that point of, okay, the differences just aren't mattering that much anymore. We need to keep it for hardware updates. And Windows 7 did have actually substantially better, surprisingly good virtual memory management performance on some things. There's some debugging stuff that we do with mapping scads of pages, and I did something with a terabyte of virtual memory set up over different things. Windows 7 is doing a lot better than XP, things I wasn't even aware that they had improved on were suddenly, in some cases, hundreds of times faster in these heavy load conditions. So that's all pleasant, but there's not a single thing that I'm salivating waiting for in the next operating system. Other I/O devices, one thing that audio is, in many cases, we can look at as essentially a solved problem right now, where we've been down the road twice in doing sophisticated audio processing, and we regretted it each time, and there's still a push like, well, let's go try it again. The difference between the presentation of the very best audio processing versus just adequate audio processing will not turn a B level or even an A- sound designer's work to be something better than a top-notch sound designer's work. We really are in the land where it is driven by the quality of the media, and there's just not that much that code is going to be able to do to improve that. Now, I have, for the first time in years, as I was doing the VR stuff, I have a little bit of an inkling to, a little bit of an itch to go do a little bit better job on the head modeling and proper tracking on there, where for games, we're assuming that you've got speakers or maybe 5.1 surround sound. It's a small fraction of the people that have headphones. In any case, they don't have head trackers on there. But when you're in the head track system with earphones on there and you're looking around, I can buy that it would be really worthwhile to go ahead and do the phase modeling, do the room modeling and the head transfer function on there, because with the head tracker, I think it makes a difference. I don't think it's worth it for a static viewer on there, where any subtle movements that you're doing are actually doing exactly the wrong thing for what your system is doing. And those subtle movements are important for your eyesight. And, I can definitively show that with the VR work. I suspect that it's similarly important for the audio side. This is all solved work. People have done all of this before, and I think that's something that's worth picking up. I'm not going to have time to in this go-round, but maybe by the time the next project comes around, we'll be able to integrate that, because I have a desire to see that in there, and it will probably make quite a good difference. I suspect similar to the positional tracking in the visual side of things. One of the I/O devices that we'd really like to see, and I don't see any great ways to it, is better force feedback in some way, where for years I have been making this pitch that it doesn't matter what we're drawing on the screen nearly as much as what we change in I/O. I looked at the Wii and the Move and the Kinect and all of this as steps that signs that changing the I/O equation is actually more important. And I think the VR side of things really convincingly shows that, where this cobbled together piece really does show something. So I/O devices are probably where the big movers are going to be. It's not going to be a great new graphics algorithm or a hyper-powerful GPU. Changes in the way we interact with our software is what's going to make things really, really change. But I have no good idea on how to do that with tactile feedback on there. And of course, when you start getting into exciting tactile feedback, you get into dangerous tactile feedback. And if you've got something that can actually manipulate a person in some way, it's dangerous. And I look at, like at Armadillo, I would look at boxes of old outmoded linear actuators we don't use anymore, and I think, I should take those in a driver board and make some kind of little ride for my son to play around on that I can drive by the computer. Because it still does matter. Like, there's a difference between if you go to Disney World or something and you ride the big rides that are swinging you around and having these extra effects on you, the gusts of wind and the changes in things that are not just optical. It does matter. There is still something to be done there. But until we get to direct retinal or direct neural stimulation on there, the limited cases, whether we can do something with gloves, I'm not a big fan of gloves. Other things that we can do with controllers. Rumble was a nice trivial addition that we had in there. There may be other modest things that can be done there. Certainly I hope on touchpads we might be getting some level of tactile feedback that's better, but I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with that. On displays, going over the size, resolution. Resolution is worth talking about a little bit on the limits of what matters there. So Apple makes a big deal about the Retina displays. You hold your iPhone out and say that this is the limit of what the eye can perceive. And there's actually fudge room there when you're talking about phase offsets about what you're looking at, but it's ballpark enough correct that you can talk about that. But you look and say, well, I want a virtual, I want a virtual reality that encompasses me, that has that same level of resolution. So you hold out your iPhone there and say, well, how many iPhone screens does that take to tile my world like that? And it's a lot. It's an impractically large number, even when we're talking about these crazy high resolutions here. But the potentially positive side of that is how little your eye actually cares about that. Because here's an experiment. Like, take your smartphone out, get it at a point where you can read a word in there, and then try, without moving your eye, to read something at the top or bottom of the display. You generally can't, because your actual foveal area of interest is only a couple hundred pixels in diameter. You only care about this very tiny amount that is this level of resolution. Everything else could be 1/10 the resolution. We actually have enough bandwidth on current display cables, if we could send exactly the pixels we want, to satisfy the optic nerve on there, essentially. If we could have a low resolution image projected over everything and then the tight focused region right where you're looking, we could do that with the graphics processing power today, with the bandwidth that we've got today, but no one has yet developed a really good solution that can do accurate tracking. We've got tracking solutions, but figuring out how to actually make a display that can position this hotspot in different areas like that is actually not a solved problem. There's thoughts of doing that with laser scanning, different things like that, but there's challenges, there's some fundamental challenges at the upper resolution end that are material science limited with the laser scanners. So there may be some other scanning technology that can wind up working, that can let you draw it out in vector patterns where you spiral around from the point, having a spiral raster scan that increases in density or is tight and then goes to a much lower rate. We can imagine things like that that would allow us, with the computing power that we've got today, to render a world that has the perceived resolution of everything around us. So hopefully that's one of those, we wait for a breakthrough. We wait for something that can resolve that. We don't have to hold up immersive VR waiting for that breakthrough, but when it happens, it'll be a dramatic change on there. It will have big effects. We might wind up seeing that focusing, that type of focal region as strictly a bandwidth compression mitigation measure there, where if we talk about this display that might have a 1920 display per eye plus the two cameras looking out at that, you've only got 1 thunderbolt's worth of bandwidth on there, but you want to update it at 120 hertz, then maybe you do wind up tracking a foveal region on there and only sending that at the full resolution and sending the rest of it at a lower resolution and letting that be blurrier, because we today can make displays with more resolution than we have bandwidth that we can easily transmit to it. Then brief update on Armadillo Aerospace to close it off for questions for anybody remaining. So it has been pretty sad for me that I haven't been able to be as involved as I used to be on there. I have been really consumed with all the software side of things and 2 kids now, and I get over to Armadillo just rarely now. I was supposed to be over there last Saturday doing the final setup for our next launch on here, where we're going to make all the final code changes for everything that we need to have on there. We are within a month of launching this. The last flight was about 95 kilometers, so we were grabbing space. We were right up there on that, but had a recovery failure, so it made a very expensive hole in the ground. The next vehicle that's pretty much together now, it's bigger, 20-inch diameter, 30 feet long or so. You can actually crouch down and get inside the payload compartment if somebody wanted to on there. Richard Garriott, Lord British, was actually in line saying he wanted to skydive out of the rocket on there, but he just got married and has a child now, so I don't think his wife's going to let him do that anymore. But people are actually interested in doing that. But the real near-term thing is we were just granted a commercial reusable launch vehicle launch license, which is the only one right now for a reusable vehicle. So we can actually take paying customers. All of our previous flights have been under either experimental permits, where we could theoretically fly to space, but we couldn't charge any money for it. The Lunar Lander Challenge sidestepped all of that by saying we're not paying for the flight, we're going to give a prize based on the result of this. And the FAA let that slide, but in general, if you want to take money from people for flying stuff, you need a commercial launch license. So we were again the pathfinder for that. We were the first reusable vehicle to fly under a commercial launch license. We were the first to fly under the experimental permit, first to fly under the level 3 waiver. So we have been the The bellwether catching some arrows in our back with all the regulatory processes on there. Vehicle can carry, we're carrying 2 payloads now, I think a Purdue University payload and a European Space Agency payload on the first flight here. Paying real money for it, I hope we don't crash. If we get this back and we can fly this regularly, it should become a going business here. It would be nice to have a real product to sell rather than trying to be like so many other aerospace companies of trying to get on the contract gravy train of, I just don't want that for the company. I want to have something of value. If you need this, if you want to fly suborbital payloads, here's what we do. We fly on a regular basis. That's where I want to be, hopefully, at the end of this year. So within a month, we should have this next flight off. If it works well, hopefully we get it back and we fly it again within a month. And build additional copies, fly this more as we work on scaling up again after that while we've got a general revenue stream coming in. So it saddens me that I can't work more on this, but I've got all of these things that I would like to build more head-mounted displays myself. I would like to work on more software R&D. I'd love to do the visual optical flow velocity tracking stuff on there, but there's just not enough hours in the day, and I have to. I do have to make the top development priority the big software projects at id. But I get some time here and there to work on the different things, and it's all still rewarding. It's a good mix of things. So everybody that's still left, I can take questions for a while longer. I'm surprised my voice hasn't given out here. I figured I was gonna lose it after an hour or so. It'll be tomorrow. I'll be croaking for all the interviews. But do we have a microphone anywhere in here? Somebody? Okay, Mike.
I don't know if it's on. Oh, yeah. So you mentioned earlier about Rage that you had an uncompressed, totally uncompressed level area, and you said you wish you could ship the game that way, but obviously, 1 terabyte's not an option. And as someone familiar with the algorithms involved, my biggest disappointment was finding out it wasn't going to be a 300 gig download from Steam. And, we hear a lot about, OnLive and how they could do more than you could do with your local desktop. And I see no reason why you couldn't have, high-speed storage supporting 300-400 gaming instances in the server, and I think that'd be a really interesting.
So it's actually better than that in that so there were a couple things regarding the textile density in Rage that we had made the decision early on to have a consistent textile density, which may have been a mistake even in the early case, where the thinking is that we saw this some in Doom 3 and really badly in enemy territory, where if you have a texture that's stretched out really low res and then you have a high res something on top of it, it doesn't look right. It doesn't feel consistent on there. So we uniformly clamped the textile density in Rage. What we can do now that we have the detail extrapolation stuff, we can say, well, everything's got 4 times the resolution, and it'll be real resolution for the things that we care about, the stuff on the desk, your paraphernalia that you want to look at, and it'll be fake extrapolated detail for all the rest of the acreage that we're not actually transmitting at that resolution. So that will help, but it actually works. The early test that we did years ago didn't really follow up on it, but if we use the same prioritization algorithms that we do for all this smart scheduling of stuff, trying to deal with Blu-ray latencies of 150 milliseconds to seek over there, it works really well over a network without us even trying very hard to optimize for that. We are at least considering trying to make an optimized network streaming thread that knows that everything is equally fast to get, so you schedule things and you have a lot of them outstanding because you can have a lot of bandwidth actually in a 50 or 80 millisecond delay there. You can have a lot of bytes coming down, a lot of different pages. Instead of pulling them in pages at a time, disk pages at a time, like 128K at a time, you would actually individually cache the 128 by 128 graphics pages. And I know we could do quite well, and I suspect we might even be able to do remarkably well with a decent connection there, and having it cached through the same cases locally. I joked about it in years past on there, but I was at least somewhat serious that you could make like an MMO that had the entire world textured with a petabyte of, you could throw literally a petabyte of surface data at it. You'd have challenges rendering all of that, but you set up all sorts of cloud instances and work through that, and it's doable there, and I think it would be pretty compelling, but that gets into scary technical risk stuff on here where we do feel a little bit burned by how long it took to mature all of this technology, but that is the type of thing that setting up network streaming for arbitrary quality downloads, I hope we get that in the upcoming product, because that is on our radar. It is sensible, it's a good fit, and it will deliver real value. It's not a guarantee right now, but technically it appears to be plenty feasible, and I definitely want to go down that road. Yeah.
My question is that it seems like in the past you've been a champion of low latency gaming as something equal in experience to, say, resolution or texture quality and enhancing the gamer's experience. Do you think it would be a worthwhile thing to create an open standard for low latency devices so that maybe a logo on the box could allow an enthusiast gamer to vote with their dollars about that experience?
So I have some hope that that's, I've kicked a bunch of companies with that notion that HDMI should have a low latency bit in the, in the bit stream on there saying, please do not do any processing on here that involves buffering. And that seems to maybe have a little bit of traction, but the display, industry it takes a while for all of that to go through. That's, again, one of those cases where if the displays were sort of like OpenGL, we would define an extension, like for the swap interval thing, and say, low latency, please. And some display vendors that supported that could just start looking for that. Everyone else would ignore it, and that would be a wonderful thing, but we don't have that sort of infrastructure in place. So likely that's something that takes years to happen. I mean, I hope it doesn't take a decade like virtual texturing on there, but it's at least on some people's radar. And I think that I have been harping on about this a lot, and I'm going to be doing yet more of it with the VR stuff as it goes on. So it's at least coming to a lot more people's attention now, both reducing the latency and increasing the scan out rate. So I have some things will get better. They won't get better as fast as we would like them to.
Hi. I had heard rumors that you were working on non-polygonal rendering. So obviously, instead of making several points to create something that looks like a sphere, but rather actually rendering a true sphere.
Okay, yeah, so there's a couple directions that I have spent a little bit of effort on in there. Analytic rasterization of higher order surfaces, spheres or NURBS or whatever, I think that's a completely losing proposition. Because adding extra smoothness, as we find over and over again, just really doesn't add that much to the quality. We've done those cases just recently where you add 10 times the smoothness to something and it just doesn't make a damn bit of difference. But adding huge amounts of interesting detail, like with the sparse voxel octree stuff, ray tracing into that, and I actually think that there's it's somewhat more plausible to do a splatting architecture on current generation hardware, where instead of tracing in, you go to an old painter's algorithm or alpha saturate on there, and just render, you plow through your entire couple hundred megs of data set on there, and you're just managing different MIPS of that. It's an interesting thing, and that actually was something that I was looking at that when I was blowing up one of these iPhone levels onto a giant screen TV and saying, man, that pixel's really annoying. If that was all a fuzzy blob rendered through all of there, this would be blurry but aliasing free on there. And it's an interesting topic, but I don't think that it's going to turn out to be. Polygons have turned out to be so fruitful from a utilization standpoint. And I've said this a few times before, and it's absolutely true, that after 4 decades of research into parallelism and multiprocessor utilization, the vertex fragment paradigm is so far and away the most successful multiprocessing architecture. It's not even close. So discounting vertexes and fragments is probably not a smart bet at this point. Eventually, I do think ray tracing will wind up taking over that, but it'll probably largely be ray tracing against polygons because of the pipeline inertia that everything's going to have by then, by now even.
So maybe something for id Tech 6 looking far down the line.
Yeah, certainly not analytic surface rasterization, and I'm a little bit down on the value that we're going to get out of all of the extra stuff there. But yes, the next step, as we do some other big thing, would be virtualizing the geometry in some way, but it's still going to be authored as polygons. Even if we rasterized it to voxels or to splats or something, it's going to be built in tools that build polygons, and that's just, there's almost zero chance that that's not going to be the case.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think first of all, we all want to really thank you, for this presentation. It's been really interesting. But so going back to the beginning of your presentation, my question is, you talked a lot about the product development or technological pipeline, in development. But from like a purely human organizational perspective, like, do you see it moving towards like agile development, or do you think that would ruin the culture of a video game?
So, I'm the last person to really be asked to expound upon social cultural factors in the company, because I'm horribly tone deaf to so many factors that a lot of people take for granted. And we've had plenty of problems at id over the years, and still do to various degrees, with being able to get a team to really everybody pull in the right direction, and everybody pitch in and do the right thing in all cases. So we don't have any kind of a silver bullet for that. We still struggle with a lot of those issues. I don't think I'm the man to solve any of those things. I have to hope that other people in the company step up and take the leadership role of getting everyone to rally around them. And that was, there's value in a lot of the non-technical things. I go on and on and on about the technical stuff because that's who I am and what I do, but that's not to say that that these are even the most important things, maybe not even the top two on there. Technology is necessary, but the value that we derive from the stuff nowadays comes from all of these other factors. And I'd like Matt Hooper to be doing more of these things and talking about the larger stuff. It's hard right now when you can't really talk about what we're doing directly, but how the team works. I actually asked about, I proposed going into a bunch of the details about what we've done internally, how teams have changed, what the problems and everything have been, and it was just suggested that I not do that. There was really talk about how it's hard to argue with Bethesda's success on there, and there is a Bethesda way of doing it is they don't talk about how the sausage is being made. You just enjoy it when it's all done. So there's there's a little bit of of a nudge that that hey, let's try and take that this way. But we have issues where we're trying to work through all of them. We just passed a major milestone internally that I hope everybody feels really proud of the work that they've done on that. But we have tried different methodologies and to varying degrees of success. I wish we had a silver bullet, but we don't.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, my question is relating to cross-OS support when it comes to video games. I was wondering if there's any, obviously Steam is on Mac and they're made an announcement that they're pushing out to Linux. Do you think that approach is the way going forward, as opposed to, say, passing through a graphics card to a virtual machine directly and just having, an integrated card for the host OS and passing your GTX 600 to a VM and having full compatibility that way? Where do you think it's going?
In many ways, the whole virtualization stuff has been a giant failure of operating systems, where in many cases, the fact that we have to have sandboxes below and hypervisors above really means that the classic OS model failed. You're supposed to have, the whole point of an OS is to isolate processes from each other and allow you to run them independently without interference, except for when you opt into doing that. But unfortunately, the notion of a platform involves standard file locations, communications with all of these services, and through neglect, we wound up with this case where the OS alone isn't enough to shield you. You start needing sandboxes, virtual machines, all these things. And it's really pretty damn unfortunate that you can't expect to have a web browser, that just launches other processes in a completely safe way, because an operating system should be able to deal with all of that. Now, virtualizing platform on top of platform is intellectually interesting in some ways, and emulation of old stuff is great, but it does come down to, again, that it's sort of appalling what we jump through with all of these steps of virtualization, and we shouldn't really have to. I will not be surprised if something that, God knows JavaScript has an immense amount of traction, and in many ways it's accidental. It's certainly not through careful analysis of the merits of something like that. It happened through somewhat accidental factors there, and we're stuck with this situation that it is appalling doing games in JavaScript, doing anything performance intensive. One of the things that I'm really thrilled about is that iOS, I credit to a large degree with saving native code in many ways. We were seeing this point where, as people were going to the common language runtime in .NET, where you're like, only Neanderthals program in C++. But when you got highly interactive mobile devices that were power limited and more limited in memory than the desktops, it was great to see. Of course, they start out saying that, Java is what runs on mobile because it's sandboxed in security. But once you start actually caring about the experience, people found out it's like, oh, actually, writing native code really does matter, and that's still important there. So platform-wise, it is a shame that we don't have that same realization really on the PC web space, that we still do have all of the sandboxes and virtualizations, that we can't have that level of protection there. I guess I have to be a little defeatist and say that probably one of these virtualized things will wind up being a significant, important platform, and I think it's going to be a shame, but it'll probably wind up happening that way. It would be great if the GPU is also threw a big wrench in all of that. When you're just talking about CPU virtualization or CPU sandboxing, that's a tractable problem. Until recently, virtualizing a GPU was just not a tractable problem. It was not something that the CPU, you can time slice it up nicely, you can virtualize the memory and throw out pages and remap them, while a GPU, traditionally, you had to swap textures as units in there. You had to do these massive thunks when you would change context and things were at or close to the resource limit. They were never safe. They really probably still aren't safe, although maybe they are. So maybe we're at a point now where everything could be virtualized, but the context still don't time slice and share as nicely as you'd want from the CPU side. It's tempting to think that we could have a cloud virtualized platform service where you sign up for a certain amount of GPU, or you share, you use it on demand, and a certain amount of CPU and a certain amount of memory. And it would be nice if that all worked out. It still seems somewhat technically risky on there, not completely solved. Probably will take a fair amount of OS, hypervisor, whatever level work to get all of that to work. It's an interesting question of if we would even want to nail down a platform and program at a low level there. I could see a good world coming out of that, where you might have a platform where here's a low-level GPU instruction set, you can program it as if you've got hardware, but it is fully virtualized. It's certainly technically feasible to consider something like that, and you could avoid most of the overhead of the drivers and a lot of the changing ground underneath you if you virtualized at a lowest level. But I'm not sure. I don't know that things are going that way, and I'd be probably a little surprised if it wound up that way. It may take another decade for the GPUs to get to the point where they really can be split up and scheduled just as easily as the CPUs. But I can be hopeful that there might be some additional work in that direction. Next.
When you talked about VR and the holodeck, my problem with the holodeck shows was how come they never ran into a wall when they're just in there? And have you worked out moving within a game? I heard somebody say something about a treadmill with handlebars that would steer you, and that seems a little silly.
So there's actually been a number of things tried in that way. There have been some interesting research that people have done with subtly changing the space that you're going through, like making hallways so they're not really straight, they actually curve a little bit as you're walking through them. And there have been a lot of papers written about stuff like that. there are a number of devices like people inside giant balls on rollers and stuff that you could move around. I actually had somebody contact me just last week that I knew from some rocketry stuff a decade ago on there, and said he was involved in some project like that. And I said I was interested but skeptical. It would be nice if something like that happened, because the current VR demo, you can play doing all of the rotating on foot. So I mean, you could stand up and rotate 90, rotate 180, and only use the joystick to go forward. And it's kind of interesting when you do that, because your body does have a sense of, I'm back to pointing the way I was before. There is an extra level there. It's a little bit weird just shuffling your feet around there, and if somebody's not managing the cords, you're going to trip on them eventually. But my end game solution for the VR stuff is going to be something wireless, something that uses optical tracking to analyze the space around it, and then you can start saying, well, I'm going to set up a playroom that you can go ahead and skin the playroom in whatever you want on there, and have real-world props that go with it that have something else happen in virtual reality. But the whole tactile sensation of actually moving and having the accelerometer sensing for that, yeah, that's another one of those waiting for a breakthrough type things. I don't think that's a near-term thing. Whether we get that first with some really clever physical thing that is both economical and not dangerous, or we have to wait until we have direct neural stimulation, I don't know. Yeah.
My question is related to that actually a little bit. Shigeru Miyamoto was discussing in some interviews about the Wii U and using it as a possible virtual reality controller in the manner of holding the controller in front of you like this and then using it to walk around. And his actual theory for that game would have been like an FPS type game. I mean, in his case, you probably wouldn't shoot things, but what's your thought on an interface in that manner, or does something like that sound cool to you?
So we'll probably talk a lot more about augmented reality stuff tomorrow at the panel, but it's fun. My kids like playing the little 3D DSi and Vita games that poke through the world on there. It's interesting. I think that in the long run, augmented reality has more impact than immersive virtual reality, although I think they can both be quite large. I mean, building a simulated world around you that's convincing has a lot of value, but augmenting the real world around you, it's basically giving you a superpower when AR works right. When you start seeing everybody's name and all the information you're supposed to know about them floating